Catherine's voice trembled as she continued her story. Victoria was so kind at first. She said she understood how difficult my situation was, being stranded with no money and no family. She offered me work at her ranch, cooking, cleaning, helping with household tasks. She said Charles needed extra help, and she would pay me well. Sarah leaned forward, hanging on every word. What happened then? At first, everything seemed fine. The Ashford Ranch is beautiful, much larger than most in the area. Victoria was polite, and Charles seemed like a decent man, though he was very quiet. But after a few days, I started to notice strange things. What kind of strange things? Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, as if she were cold. There were other women there. 3 of them, all living in the bunkhouse that was supposed to be for ranch hands. When I asked Victoria about them, she said they were also employees, women who had found themselves in difficult circumstances and needed work. Other mail-order brides. I think so, though Victoria never said that directly. But they all had the same look, desperate, afraid, trapped. And they never seemed to leave the ranch. In all the time I was there, I never saw any of them go to town or have any contact with the outside world. Sarah felt a growing sense of dread. How long were you there? 6 weeks. And in that time, I learned that we weren't employees at all. We were prisoners. The word hung in the air between them. Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Prisoners? What do you mean? Victoria controlled everything. When we ate, when we worked, where we could go. She said it was for our own protection, that we were safe on the ranch, and the outside world was dangerous for women without families or money. But if any of us tried to leave, she would threaten us. Threaten you how? She said she had connections with the law, that if we left the ranch, she would have us arrested for vagrancy or prostitution. She said no one would believe our word against hers, that we were just desperate women trying to cause trouble for a respectable family. Sarah's mind was racing. This explains so much. The systematic deception of mail-order brides, the careful selection of women with no family and no money. Victoria wasn't just playing cruel tricks. She was running some kind of trafficking operation. Catherine, what was she making you do? What kind of work? Catherine was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Domestic work, mostly. Cooking, cleaning, laundry. But there were also visitors. Men who would come to the ranch and pay Victoria money. She would make us serve them dinner, entertain them, make them feel welcome. Entertain them how? Nothing improper, if that's what you're thinking. But we had to dress nicely, smile, be charming. Victoria would introduce us as her cousins visiting from back east or friends of the family. The men never knew we were being held against our will. Sarah was starting to understand. She was using you to help her husband's business, making the ranch seem more prosperous and welcoming than it really was. I think so. Charles deals in cattle, but I got the impression he was involved in other things too. There were always men coming and going, talking business in hushed voices. And sometimes they would bring wagons full of goods that didn't look like legitimate merchandise. You think Charles was involved in smuggling? I'm not sure. But whatever was going on, Victoria needed us to help maintain the illusion that they were a respectable, successful family. And she made sure we could never expose them by keeping us trapped and afraid. How did you escape? Catherine managed a small smile. Victoria made a mistake. She trusted me to go to town with her one day to buy supplies. She thought I was too scared to try anything. But when she was distracted talking to the shopkeeper, I slipped away and hid in the back of a freight wagon that was leaving town. And you've been hiding ever since. I've been living rough, trying to figure out what to do. I don't have any proof of what Victoria was doing, and, like she said, who would believe me? But when I heard about your situation, I knew I had to warn you. Sarah reached out and squeezed Catherine's hand. I believe you. And you're not alone anymore. Sheriff Morrison is investigating Victoria. We found evidence that she's been forging letters and deceiving mail-order brides. Really, for the first time, hope flickered in Catherine's eyes. Someone's actually looking into it. Yes. In fact, they're out looking for Victoria right now. She ran when she realized we were onto her. Catherine's face went pale. She ran? But what about the other women? What about the ones still at the ranch? Sarah's heart sank. In all the excitement of pursuing Victoria, No one had thought about the possibility that there might be other victims still trapped at the Ashford Ranch. If Catherine was telling the truth, there could be 3 women in immediate danger. "We have to tell Sheriff Morrison," Sarah said urgently. "As soon as he gets back." "What if he doesn't believe me? What if Victoria's already moved them?" Sarah stood up, her mind made up. "Then, we'll have to do something ourselves. Catherine, do you know the way back to the Ashford Ranch?" Catherine nodded slowly. "Yes, but, Sarah, we can't go there. It's too dangerous. If Victoria comes back, she's being pursued by a posse. She won't be going back to the ranch tonight. This might be our only chance to help those women." They made their way carefully back to the boarding house, where Sarah quickly changed into her riding clothes. She left a note for Martha explaining where she had gone and why, then slipped out to the stable behind the building. Martha kept 2 horses there, the mare Sarah had borrowed earlier and an older gelding used for pulling the wagon. Catherine was nervous about the plan, but she agreed that they couldn't wait for the sheriff to return. If Victoria does escape, she might come back for the other women, or she might just abandon them. Either way, they're in danger. The ride to the Ashford Ranch took over an hour in the darkness. Catherine guided them along back roads and cattle trails to avoid being seen. The moon was bright enough to light their way, but it also made Sarah worry that they would be visible to anyone watching. The Ashford Ranch was much larger than Thomas Mitchell's modest spread. The main house was a 2-story structure with elaborate gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch. There were numerous outbuildings, barns, stables, bunkhouses, and what looked like a small office building. Everything spoke of wealth and success. But, as they approached, Sarah noticed that the place seemed almost deserted. No lights showed in any of the windows, and there were no sounds of livestock or human activity. "Something's wrong," Catherine whispered. "There should be ranch hands around, even at night." Charles always kept several men working here. They tied their horses to a tree about a quarter-mile from the buildings and approached on foot. The main house was dark and silent. When Sarah peered through a window, she could see that the rooms had been hastily abandoned. Drawers were pulled open, papers were scattered on the floor, and valuable items were missing from their obvious places. "They've cleared out," Sarah said grimly. "Charles and Victoria both." But Catherine was pointing toward the bunkhouse. "Look, there's a light." Sure enough, a faint glow was visible through one of the bunkhouse windows. The 2 women crept closer, taking care to stay in the shadows. As they got nearer, they could hear voices, women's voices, frightened and urgent. "Don't understand what's happening. Told us to stay here, but that was hours ago. Something's wrong, I know it." Catherine and Sarah exchanged glances. The women were still here, but they were clearly upset and confused about what was happening. Sarah approached the door carefully and knocked softly. "Hello? Is anyone in there?" The voices inside immediately fell silent. After a moment, someone called out nervously, "Who is it?" "My name is Sarah Walker. I'm here to help you. Is Catherine Mills with you?" There was a gasp from inside, and then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened to reveal a young woman with blonde hair and red-rimmed eyes. "Catherine? You mean Catherine escaped? She's right here with me," Sarah said, gesturing for Catherine to step forward. The reunion was emotional. The woman at the door, who introduced herself as Ruth, embraced Catherine tearfully. "We thought something terrible had happened to you. Victoria said you had stolen money and run off, but we didn't believe her." Catherine shook her head. "I didn't steal anything. I escaped because I couldn't stand being trapped here anymore." Ruth led them into the bunkhouse, where 2 other women were waiting. Margaret was a redhead from Chicago who had come to marry a railroad worker. Alice was a petite brunette from Philadelphia who had answered an advertisement from a sheep rancher. Both had the same story. They had arrived to find their intended husbands dead, and Victoria had rescued them with offers of employment. "But we're not employees," Margaret said bitterly. "We're slaves. Victoria controls everything we do, everywhere we go. We can't leave the ranch, can't write letters to family, can't even talk to the hired hands without her permission." Alice, who seemed younger than the others, was crying. "I just want to go home. I want to see my sister again. But Victoria says if I try to leave, she'll have me arrested." Sarah felt a surge of anger toward Victoria Ashford. These women had come west hoping for new lives, and Instead, they had fallen into a trap that was destroying their spirits and their futures. You don't have to be afraid anymore, Sarah told them. Sheriff Morrison is investigating Victoria for fraud. She's been forging letters and deceiving mail-order brides across the territory. And now we have witnesses to what she's been doing. But where is Victoria now? Ruth asked. And Charles? They left hours ago in a hurry, told us to stay here and wait for instructions. Catherine explained about Victoria's flight from town and the posse that was pursuing her. She knows the law is onto her. She's probably trying to get as far away as possible. What about us? Margaret asked. What happens to us now? Sarah had been thinking about that question. You come back to town with us. Sheriff Morrison will protect you, and the town will help you figure out what to do next. You're not prisoners anymore. It took some convincing, but eventually all three women agreed to leave the ranch. They gathered their few belongings. Victoria had allowed them very little personal property, and prepared to make the journey to Cedar Ridge. As they were preparing to leave, Alice made a discovery that changed everything. In her haste to pack, Victoria had left behind a small wooden box in the main house. Alice had seen Victoria with the box many times and knew it contained important papers. Maybe there's something in here that will help prove what she's been doing, Alice suggested. Inside the box, they found a treasure trove of evidence. There were forged letters in the handwriting of at least a dozen different men, all of them supposedly seeking mail-order brides. There were receipts for money transfers, showing that Victoria had been systematic about sending travel funds to women across the country. And, most damning of all, there was a ledger book where Victoria had kept track of her operation. The ledger showed names, dates, and locations. Victoria had been running her scheme for over 2 years, targeting small towns across Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana. She had deceived dozens of women, bringing them west under false pretenses. But the ledger also showed payments, large sums of money being transferred to accounts in Denver and San Francisco. She was selling information, Sarah realized as she studied the entries. Look at these payments. They're too large to be just from helping her husband's business. Someone was paying her for information about the women she was bringing west. Margaret looked over Sarah's shoulder at the ledger. Information about what? About women with no family, no money, no connections. Women who wouldn't be missed if they disappeared. The implications were chilling. Victoria's operation was more extensive and more sinister than any of them had imagined. She wasn't just exploiting vulnerable women for labor. She was identifying them for someone else, someone who was willing to pay substantial amounts for that information. As dawn began to break over the mountains, the 5 women made their way back towards Cedar Ridge. Sarah led the way on her borrowed mare, while the others rode double on the remaining horses. The evidence from Victoria's box was safely tucked in Sarah's saddlebags. They were about halfway to town when they encountered Sheriff Morrison and his posse returning from their search. The sheriff's face was grim as he listened to their story and examined the evidence they had found. We lost Victoria's trail about 20 miles north, Morrison reported. She knows this country well, and she had too much of a head start. But this evidence changes everything. This isn't just local fraud. This is part of something much bigger. Morrison examined the ledger carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each page. These payments are coming from someone in Denver. And look at this. There are references to shipments being sent east. What kind of shipments? Sarah felt a chill as she considered the possibilities. Sheriff, what if Victoria wasn't just exploiting these women for labor? What if she was selling them? Morrison's face went pale. You mean human trafficking? It would explain everything. Why she targeted women with no families, no money, no connections. Why she kept them isolated and afraid. And why someone would pay her so much money for information about them. Jake Sullivan, who had joined the posse, spoke up. Sheriff, we need to get word to the authorities in Denver immediately. If this is part of a larger trafficking ring, there could be dozens of women in danger. Morrison nodded grimly. I'll send a telegram as soon as we get back to town. In the meantime, these women will need protection and care. As they rode into Cedar Ridge, word of their return spread quickly. Martha was waiting anxiously at the boarding house, along with Dr. Crawford and Emily Watson. The 4 rescued women were taken to the boarding house, where Martha and Emily began the process of caring for them and helping them decide what to do next. Sarah sat in the parlor, exhausted but relieved. They had exposed Victoria's operation and rescued 4 women from a terrible situation. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there were still unanswered questions. "Penny, for your thoughts," Jake said, sitting down beside her. "I keep thinking about Charles Ashford. Do you really think he was an innocent victim in all this? Or was he part of Victoria's scheme?" Jake considered the question. Hard to say. He could have been intimidated into going along with it, especially if Victoria had something to hold over him. Or he could have been a willing partner. Either way, he's gone now. They both are. For now. But Sheriff Morrison is right. This evidence will help the authorities track them down. And, more importantly, it will help expose the larger organization they were working with. Sarah nodded, but she still felt unsettled. "Jake, what about me? What happens to me now?" Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "What do you want to happen, Sarah?" It was a good question. Sarah had come to Wyoming Territory expecting to marry Thomas Mitchell and start a new life on his ranch. That dream was gone, but, surprisingly, she found that she didn't want to return to Boston. The vast sky, the endless horizons, the sense of possibility, it all called to something deep inside her. "I think I want to stay," she said slowly. "I want to make a life here. But I don't know how." Jake smiled. "There are always opportunities for determined people on the frontier. Emily mentioned that the school board is looking for an assistant teacher. Martha could use help with the boarding house." Or, he hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "Or what? Or you could consider that Thomas Mitchell's ranch is still sitting empty. According to territorial law, if no heirs come forward within 6 months, the property will go to auction. You could put in a claim." Sarah's eyes widened. "You mean I could actually buy the ranch?" "With the right backing, yes. It's good land, and Tom had started to build up a decent herd. It would take work, and you'd need help, but it's possible." Sarah felt a flutter of excitement. The idea of owning her own land, building her own life on her own terms, was intoxicating. Would you help me? If I decided to try?" Jake's smile widened. "Sarah, I'd be honored to help you. In fact, I've been hoping you'd ask." Over the following days, the full scope of Victoria's operation became clear. Sheriff Morrison's telegraph to Denver authorities resulted in raids on several locations, leading to the arrest of a man named William Crane, who had been buying information about vulnerable women for his own trafficking operation. Crane had been shipping women east to work in factories under conditions that amounted to slavery. Victoria and Charles Ashford were eventually captured trying to cross into Canada. Both faced serious federal charges for their roles in the trafficking scheme. Charles, it turned out, had been deeply in debt when he married Victoria, and she had used his financial desperation to force him into cooperation with her criminal activities. The 4 women Sarah had helped rescue all chose different paths forward. Ruth decided to return to her family in Ohio, using money donated by the townspeople of Cedar Ridge. Margaret found work as a seamstress and eventually married a local widower. Alice took a position as Emily Watson's assistant at the school and discovered she had a talent for teaching. Catherine Mills chose to stay at the boarding house and help Martha with the business. The experience of being trapped and helpless had left her wary of putting herself in anyone else's power, but she found purpose in helping other travelers who found themselves in difficult circumstances. As for Sarah, she did indeed put in a claim for Thomas Mitchell's ranch. With Jake's help and advice from other local ranchers, she learned to manage cattle, repair fences, and handle the 1,000 small challenges that came with frontier life. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she left Boston, but it was better than anything she could have dreamed. 6 months after arriving in Cedar Ridge as a deceived mail-order bride, Sarah stood on the porch of her own home, watching the sun set over the rolling hills of Wyoming Territory. Jake's ranch was visible in the distance, and she knew he would be riding over soon for supper, as had become their custom. She thought about Thomas Mitchell, the man she had never met but who had unknowingly provided her with the opportunity for a new life. His letters, forged though they were, had brought her to this beautiful, challenging place where she had found not just a home, but a community of people who cared about each other. The mail-order bride scheme that was supposed to trap her had instead set her free. She was no longer Sarah Walker, the forgotten factory worker from Boston. She was Sarah Mitchell now, She had legally taken the surname in honor of the man whose life had been stolen, but whose legacy lived on in her ranch. As Jake's familiar figure appeared on the horizon, riding toward her through the golden light of evening, Sarah smiled and went inside to check on the dinner she was preparing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, cattle to tend, fences to mend, crops to plant. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, with the people who had become her chosen family. The forgotten mail-order bride had stayed awake through the long night of deception and danger. And when the cowboy came riding through the dawn, she was ready to greet him not as a victim seeking rescue, but as a partner ready to build something beautiful together in the wild, wide-open country they both called home. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and Sarah felt her heart answer with its own wild song of freedom and possibility. She had traveled 2,000 miles to find a life that didn't exist, only to discover that she could create an even better life than the one she had imagined. Sometimes the best dreams were the ones you never knew you were dreaming until they came true. The frontier had claimed another soul, but this time it was a willing surrender, a choice made with eyes wide open and a heart full of hope. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell was home at last. Sarah handed the paper back to Sheriff Morrison and stepped closer to him, lowering her voice so the crowd wouldn't overhear. Those initials in the corner. VA. I met a woman this morning named Victoria Ashford. She seemed very interested in my situation. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied the paper again. Victoria Ashford? Charles Ashford's wife? That's a serious accusation, Miss Walker. What makes you think she's involved? I can't prove anything yet, but something about her felt wrong. She knew details about my situation that seemed odd for a casual conversation, and she made some comments about mail-order brides that felt calculated. Morrison folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. I'll look into it. In the meantime, don't mention this to anyone else. If you're right, we don't want to spook her before we can investigate properly. Sarah nodded and watched as the crowd dispersed. Her mind was spinning with possibilities, but none of them made sense yet. Why would a wealthy woman go to such elaborate lengths to deceive mail-order brides? What was she hoping to accomplish? That afternoon, Sarah decided to visit Emily Watson at the school. When the children were dismissed for the day, Emily invited her to stay for tea. The schoolhouse was simple but cheerful, with colorful drawings pinned to the walls and shelves full of well-worn books. I wanted to ask you about something, Sarah said as Emily poured tea from a blue ceramic pot. Do you know Victoria Ashford well? Emily's expression became guarded. Victoria? Not well, no. She's only lived here for about 2 years, since she married Charles. Why do you ask? I met her this morning, and something about her struck me as odd. She seemed very interested in my situation with Thomas Mitchell. Emily was quiet for a long moment, stirring honey into her tea. Sarah, I don't want to spread gossip, but since you asked, Victoria is not well liked in town. She puts on airs, acts like she's better than everyone else. And there have been some strange things since she arrived. What kind of strange things? Well, for one thing, Charles changed after he married her. He used to be friendly, involved in community events. Now he rarely comes to town, and when he does, he seems nervous and unhappy. Some people think she has too much influence over him. Sarah leaned forward with interest. What else? There have been rumors about her past. Nobody knows where Charles met her or where she came from. She claims to be from San Francisco, but her accent doesn't sound Californian. And Emily hesitated. This might sound silly, but several people have noticed that she asks a lot of questions about newcomers to town, especially single women. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. What kind of questions? Where they came from, whether they have family, how much money they have. Martha mentioned that Victoria stopped by the boarding house last month asking about a young widow who was passing through. She wanted to know if the woman was planning to stay in town or move on. Sarah set down her teacup with shaking hands. Emily, I need to tell you something, but you must promise to keep it confidential. Emily nodded solemnly, and Sarah told her about the initials on the practice paper and her suspicions about Victoria. Emily's face grew pale as she listened. Oh my goodness, Emily whispered. If you're right, she's been systematically deceiving women for months. But why? What does she gain from it? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. That evening, Sarah sat in her room trying to piece together the puzzle. She had Thomas Mitchell's letters spread out on the bed, along with a piece of paper where she was writing down everything she knew about Victoria Ashford. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that Victoria was behind the deception. But there was still the question of motive. What could Victoria possibly gain from luring mail-order brides to Cedar Ridge under false pretenses? And where were the other women? Bob Eachin had mentioned similar cases in other towns. What had happened to those women? A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Martha entered carrying a tray with a cup of hot chocolate and some cookies. "I thought you might like a little something before bed. You've had such a difficult day." "Thank you, Martha. You've been so kind to me." Martha sat down on the edge of the bed and noticed the letters spread out. "Still trying to make sense of it all? I'm beginning to think Victoria Ashford is involved somehow." Martha's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Victoria? That's quite an accusation. What makes you think so?" Sarah showed her the initials on the practice paper and explained her conversation with Emily. Martha listened thoughtfully, occasionally nodding. "You know," Martha said slowly, "now that I think about it, Victoria has been asking questions about you since word got around town about your situation. She stopped by this afternoon while you were out, wanted to know how long you were planning to stay and whether you had any family back east." Sarah felt another chill. "What did you tell her?" "Just that you were a nice girl in a difficult situation and that the town was trying to help you." But something about the way she asked, it felt like she was fishing for information. They were interrupted by the sound of horses outside. Sarah went to the window and saw two riders approaching the boarding house. One was Sheriff Morrison. The other was a man she didn't recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair visible under his hat. Even in the dim light from the street lamps, there was something familiar about him. "Looks like the sheriff has company," Martha observed. "Wonder what brings him by so late." A few minutes later, Martha was called downstairs. Sarah could hear voices in the parlor, but couldn't make out the words. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she crept to the top of the stairs to listen. "Found more evidence at the ranch," Sheriff Morrison was saying. "Looks like someone's been forging documents there for months. Not just Tom's letters, but other people's too. Any idea who's behind it?" The second voice was deep and pleasant, with a slight accent. "We have a suspect, but I need more proof before I can make an arrest. Problem is, if I'm right, we're dealing with someone who has a lot of influence in this community." Sarah strained to hear more, but the voices dropped lower. After a few more minutes, she heard the front door close and the sound of horses riding away. Martha came back upstairs looking troubled. "What was that about?" Sarah asked. "Sheriff Morrison wanted to let me know that he's found more evidence of the forgery operation. He's also arranged for some extra protection for you." "Protection? Why would I need protection?" Martha looked uncomfortable. "He thinks whoever's behind this might see you as a threat. You're asking questions, poking around. If someone's been running a criminal operation, they might not want you exposing them." Sarah felt a flutter of fear, but she pushed it down. "I'm not going to stop looking for answers just because someone might be unhappy about it." "I know, dear. And Sheriff Morrison knows that too. That's why he's asked someone to keep an eye on things." The next morning, Sarah woke early and dressed quickly. She had decided to ride out to Thomas Mitchell's ranch to see it for herself. Maybe there was something the sheriff had missed, some clue that would help her understand what had happened. She went downstairs and found Martha in the kitchen preparing breakfast. "I'd like to borrow a horse today," Sarah said. "I want to visit the Mitchell ranch." Martha looked worried. "I don't think that's a good idea, Sarah. Sheriff Morrison said it might not be safe." "I'll be careful, but I need to see the place where I was supposed to start my new life. Maybe it will help me understand what really happened." After some discussion, Martha reluctantly agreed to let Sarah borrow her mare, a gentle bay named Rosie. Sarah had learned to ride as a child visiting her aunt's farm, though it had been years since she'd been on a horse. Still, it came back to her quickly enough. The ride to the Mitchell ranch took about an hour. The Wyoming landscape was breathtaking. Rolling hills covered with grass that moved like waves in the wind, distant mountains rising against the blue sky, and a sense of space and freedom that Sarah had never experienced in crowded Boston. The ranch itself was modest but well-maintained. The main house was a simple wooden structure with a covered porch and stone chimney. There were several outbuildings, a barn, a chicken coop, a small bunkhouse for hired hands. Everything looked sturdy and practical, built to last in the harsh frontier environment. Sarah tied Rosie to the hitching post and walked up to the house. The front door was unlocked, as Sheriff Morrison had said. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was simple but comfortable. The main room served as both kitchen and parlor, with a large stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, and shelves lined with books. Sarah was surprised by the books: poetry, philosophy, novels by Charles Dickens, and George Eliot. Thomas Mitchell had clearly been an educated man. She wandered through the small house, trying to imagine what her life might have been like here. The bedroom was simple but clean, with a large bed covered by a colorful quilt and a window that looked out over the hills. The kitchen was well equipped with modern conveniences: a cast-iron stove, a pump for water, shelves stocked with dishes, and cookware. In the desk in the main room, Sarah found more evidence of the kind of man Thomas Mitchell had been. There were letters from a sister in Colorado, receipts for cattle purchases, and a journal where he recorded daily activities on the ranch. His handwriting was neat and careful, exactly matching the letters Sarah had received. But there were also signs of the recent intruder. Ashes in the fireplace that were too fresh to be from 6 weeks ago. Food scraps in the kitchen. Blankets on the bed that had clearly been slept in recently. Someone had definitely been living here since Thomas's death. Sarah was examining the desk more carefully when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Her heart jumped with fear. What if it was the person who had been living here, returning unexpectedly? She looked around for somewhere to hide, but the house was too small to offer much concealment. The front door opened, and Sarah held her breath. But instead of a dangerous intruder, Sheriff Morrison stepped inside, followed by the tall man she had glimpsed the night before. "Miss Walker," Morrison called out, "I saw your horse outside. You shouldn't be here alone." Sarah emerged from behind the desk, feeling both relieved and embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Sheriff. I just wanted to see the place for myself. I understand, but it's not safe. We still don't know who's been using this place or whether they might come back." Morrison gestured to his companion. "Miss Walker, I'd like you to meet Jake Sullivan. He's been helping me with the investigation." The tall man stepped forward and touched the brim of his hat politely. "Miss Walker, I'm sorry about the circumstances that brought you to Cedar Ridge." Sarah studied his face in the daylight. He had dark brown eyes, a strong jaw, and sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. There was something steady and reassuring about his presence. "Mr. Sullivan, are you a deputy?" "Not exactly," Jake said with a slight smile. "I'm a cattle rancher from the next valley over. But I knew Tom Mitchell well, and I've been helping Sheriff Morrison figure out what happened here." Sheriff Morrison walked around the house, examining the signs of recent habitation. Whoever was living here cleared out in a hurry. Left behind some interesting things, though. He led them to the bedroom and pointed to a small pile of items on the dresser that Sarah hadn't noticed before. There was a lady's handkerchief with delicate embroidery, a few hairpins, and a piece of jewelry, a small brooch with a distinctive design. "These don't belong to Tom," Morrison said, "and they're not old enough to have belonged to his late wife." Sarah picked up the brooch and examined it closely. It was made of silver and featured an intricate pattern of leaves and flowers. Something about it seemed familiar, but she couldn't place where she might have seen it. "Have you seen this before?" Jake asked, noticing her expression. "Maybe. I'm not sure." Sarah frowned, trying to remember. "It looks expensive. Too expensive for a criminal hiding out in an abandoned ranch house." "That's what I thought too," Morrison agreed. "This is the kind of jewelry a wealthy woman would wear." They searched the house more thoroughly, looking for any other clues about who had been living there. In the barn, Jake found evidence that at least 2 horses had been kept there recently. The straw in the stalls was fresh, and there were oats in the feed buckets. Whoever was here had help, Jake observed. This wasn't just one person hiding out. This was an operation. As they prepared to leave the ranch, Sarah took one last look around. This should have been her new home, her fresh start. Instead, it had become the center of a mystery that seemed to grow more complex by the hour. On the ride back to town, Jake rode alongside Sarah, while Sheriff Morrison took the lead. Jake was easy to talk to, and Sarah found herself telling him about her life in Boston, her decision to answer Thomas Mitchell's advertisement, and her growing suspicions about Victoria Ashford. You think Mrs. Ashford is behind all this? Jake asked. The evidence seems to point that way. The initials on the practice paper, her interest in my situation, the questions she's been asking around town. But I still can't figure out why. Jake was quiet for a moment. Sarah, may I call you Sarah? There's something you should know about Charles Ashford. His first wife died under mysterious circumstances about 3 years ago. She supposedly fell from her horse and broke her neck, but some people had questions about the accident. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of questions? She was an excellent rider, had been riding since childhood. It seemed strange that she would fall from a gentle trail horse on familiar ground. And Charles remarried very quickly, within 6 months, to a woman nobody had ever seen before. Victoria, right? And since then, Charles has become increasingly isolated. He rarely comes to town anymore, and when he does, he seems nervous and unhappy. Some people think Victoria has some kind of hold over him. Sarah thought about this new information. Do you think Victoria might have killed Charles's first wife? I don't know, but I think there's more to Victoria Ashford than meets the eye. And if she's been luring mail-order brides to various towns under false pretenses, we need to figure out what she's doing with them. They were approaching Cedar Ridge when they saw a cloud of dust on the road ahead. As they got closer, they could see it was a wagon moving fast, too fast for the rough terrain. Sheriff Morrison spurred his horse forward to get a better look. The wagon was being driven by a woman with auburn hair streaming behind her. Even at a distance, Sarah could see it was Victoria Ashford. She was alone and driving like someone being pursued. That's her, Sarah called out to Jake. That's Victoria Ashford. Jake and Sarah urged their horses forward to catch up with Sheriff Morrison. By the time they reached town, Victoria's wagon was nowhere to be seen. Morrison rode directly to his office and quickly organized a posse to search for her. If she's running, it means she knows we're onto her, Morrison said as he checked his rifle. Question is, where would she go? Jake had an idea. There's an old mining camp about 20 miles north of here. It's been abandoned for years, but the buildings are still standing. If someone wanted to hide out, it would be a good place. Morrison nodded. Worth checking. Jake, I want you to take Sarah back to the boarding house and make sure she's safe. If Victoria's desperate enough to run, she might be desperate enough to do something dangerous. Sarah started to protest. I want to come with you. This whole thing started with me. Absolutely not, Morrison said firmly. It's too dangerous. We don't know what we're dealing with yet. Jake placed a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. He's right, Sarah. Let the sheriff handle this. You'll be safe at the boarding house. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. As Morrison and his men rode out of town, Jake escorted her back to Martha's. But neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows near the church, a figure that followed them at a distance, staying carefully out of sight. At the boarding house, Martha was waiting anxiously. I heard there was some excitement. Is everything all right? Jake explained what had happened while Sarah sat in the parlor, feeling frustrated and helpless. She had come so close to getting answers, only to have Victoria slip away at the last moment. I should be out there with them, she said. This is my fight too. Sheriff Morrison knows what he's doing, Jake assured her. And you're safer here. But as the afternoon wore on with no word from the posse, Sarah's anxiety grew. What if Victoria escaped? What if they never found out the truth about what had happened to Thomas Mitchell and the other mail-order brides? As evening approached, Jake prepared to leave. I want to check on my own ranch, make sure everything's secure there. But I'll be back in the morning. Mr. Sullivan. Jake, Sarah said as he prepared to mount his horse. Thank you for everything you've done to help me. Jake smiled, and for a moment their eyes met and held. It's been my pleasure, Sarah. I just hope we can get this sorted out soon. After Jake left, Sarah tried to settle down for the evening, but she felt restless and worried. She helped Martha with the supper dishes, tried to read a book from the parlor shelf, and attempted to write a letter to her friend back in Boston. But nothing could distract her from thinking about Victoria Ashford and what the sheriff's posse might find. Around 9 o'clock, as Sarah was getting ready for bed, she heard a soft tapping at her bedroom window. Her heart jumped with fear. The window was on the second floor. Who could possibly be tapping on it? She approached the window cautiously and peered out through the curtains. In the darkness below, she could just make out a figure standing near the building. The person was gesturing for her to open the window. Sarah's first instinct was to call for help, but something made her hesitate. The figure wasn't trying to break in or acting threatening. Instead, whoever it was seemed to be trying to get her attention without alerting the rest of the house. Against her better judgment, Sarah carefully opened the window and leaned out. "Who's there?" she whispered. "Please don't be afraid," came a voice from below. It was a woman's voice, young and frightened. "I need to talk to you. It's about Victoria Ashford." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" "My name is Catherine. Catherine Mills. I was one of the mail-order brides." "Like you." Sarah stared down at the shadowy figure, her mind racing. "Another mail-order bride? Wait there," she whispered. "I'll come down." Sarah threw a shawl over her nightgown and crept downstairs as quietly as possible. The boarding house was quiet. Martha and the other guests had all gone to bed. Sarah slipped out the back door and found the young woman waiting in the shadow of the building. In the moonlight, Sarah could see that Catherine was probably about her own age, with brown hair and plain features. Her clothes were worn and dirty, as if she had been traveling rough for some time. "How did you know I was here?" Sarah whispered. "I've been watching the town for days, trying to figure out what to do. When I saw you arrive and heard people talking about another mail-order bride, I knew I had to warn you." "Warn me about what?" Catherine glanced around nervously. "Can we go somewhere private to talk? It's not safe to be out here in the open." Sarah thought quickly. The church would be unlocked. It always was in frontier towns. "Follow me." They made their way carefully through the dark streets to the small wooden church at the end of town. The door creaked slightly as Sarah opened it, but they slipped inside without being seen. The interior was dark except for a few beams of moonlight streaming through the windows. "Now," Sarah said, keeping her voice low, "tell me what's going on." Catherine sat down heavily in one of the wooden pews, as if telling her story required all her strength. "I came here 3 months ago to marry a man named David Peterson. I had letters from him, just like you had from Thomas Mitchell. But when I arrived, I found out David Peterson had died 2 months earlier." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. "The same thing that happened to me." "Exactly. But I didn't have anywhere to go, no money to get home. I was desperate. That's when Victoria Ashford found me." Sarah Elizabeth Walker pressed her face against the cold window of the stagecoach as it rumbled through the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming Territory. The year was 1884, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden buildings that lined the main street. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the worn letter in her gloved hands. The letter that had changed her entire life. 3 months ago, she had been living in a cramped boarding house in Boston, working 16-hour days in a textile factory. Her fingers were permanently stained with dye, her back ached constantly, and her future looked as bleak as the gray Massachusetts winter. Then, Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper, had shown her an advertisement in the newspaper. Mail-order brides wanted for respectable gentlemen in Wyoming Territory. Good character required. Steady income promised. At 22, Sarah had never been courted properly. Her plain brown hair and unremarkable features had never caught the attention of any Boston gentleman. She was too poor to attract a husband of substance and too educated to settle for a factory worker. When she saw the advertisement, something stirred inside her chest. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just desperation. She had written to Thomas Mitchell, a rancher who claimed to own 300 acres outside Cedar Ridge. His letters had been brief, but kind. He promised a comfortable home, respect, and a chance at happiness. He had even sent money for the train fare and stagecoach journey. Sarah had packed her few belongings, said goodbye to the only life she had ever known, and traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. Now, as the stagecoach pulled to a stop in front of the general store, Sarah felt her stomach twist with nervousness. She stepped down onto the dusty street, her dark blue traveling dress already covered with a fine layer of dirt. The driver handed down her small trunk and carpetbag, tipped his hat, and climbed back onto his seat. "This is as far as we go, miss," he called down. "The Mitchell Ranch is about 5 miles north. Someone should be along to fetch you." Sarah stood alone on the wooden sidewalk as the stagecoach rolled away. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. A few people walked past, glancing at her curiously. A woman in a faded calico dress nodded politely before hurrying into the mercantile. Two men in dusty work clothes paused their conversation to stare at her before continuing on their way. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The sun dropped below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Sarah's confidence began to crumble. She sat down on her trunk, trying to appear calm while panic started to build in her chest. What if Thomas had changed his mind? What if he had forgotten she was arriving today? The general store closed. The saloon across the street grew louder as more cowboys finished their work for the day. Sarah remained on the sidewalk, her hands folded in her lap, trying to look like she belonged somewhere. A cold wind picked up, making her shiver in her traveling dress. "You waiting for someone, miss?" Sarah looked up to see an elderly man with a white beard and kind eyes. He wore a clean apron over his clothes and had the look of a shopkeeper. "Yes, sir. I'm supposed to meet Thomas Mitchell. He owns a ranch north of town." The man's expression changed slightly. He glanced around, then sat down on a wooden crate beside her. "Miss, I'm Walt Brennan. I own the general store here. I know most folks in these parts, and I know Tom Mitchell." Something in his voice made Sarah's heart sink. Is something wrong? Walt removed his hat and ran his fingers through his thinning hair. "Well, miss, Tom Mitchell died about 6 weeks ago. Kicked by a horse. Broke his neck." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face. "Died? But, I received a letter from him just 3 weeks ago. He said he was looking forward to meeting me." Walt's face grew troubled. "That's mighty strange, miss. Tom was buried 6 weeks past. The whole town attended the service. His ranch has been sitting empty since then." Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. "Then, who wrote to me? Who sent me the money for the journey?" "I don't rightly know, miss. But someone's been playing a cruel trick on you, or there's been some terrible mistake." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had come too far and risked too much to break down now. "What am I supposed to do? I have no money to get home. I used everything I had just to get here." Walt stood up and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Now don't you worry. We'll figure something out. Cedar Ridge folks look after each other, and that includes travelers in trouble. You can't stay out here all night. My wife Martha runs a boarding house just down the street. She'll put you up while we sort this mess out." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude toward this kind stranger. "I can't pay much. We'll worry about that later. Come on, let's get you settled." Walt picked up her trunk while Sarah carried her carpet bag. They walked down the quiet street to a 2-story white house with a painted sign that read, "Brennan's Boarding House. Clean rooms, good meals." A woman with graying hair and a warm smile opened the door before they reached the porch. "Walt, what have you got there?" "Martha, this is—" "I'm sorry, miss, I didn't catch your name." "Sarah Walker." "Sarah Elizabeth Walker." Sarah here came all the way from Boston to marry Tom Mitchell, but she didn't know about his passing. "She needs a place to stay while we figure out what happened." Martha's eyes filled with sympathy. "Oh, you poor dear. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted and hungry. Walt, take her things up to the blue room. Sarah, you come with me to the kitchen. I've got stew on the stove." The boarding house was simple but clean. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, with checkered curtains at the windows and the smell of fresh bread in the air. Martha bustled around, fixing a plate of beef stew and buttered biscuits. She poured a cup of coffee and set it all in front of Sarah. "Now you eat up and tell me what happened." Between bites of the best meal she had eaten in months, Sarah told her story. She showed Martha the letters from Thomas Mitchell, including the most recent one that had been postmarked just 3 weeks earlier. Martha examined them carefully, her brow furrowed with concern. "These are definitely Tom's words," she said finally. "I'd recognize his handwriting anywhere. He used to write orders for supplies from our store. But Walt's right, Tom died 6 weeks ago. I was at his funeral myself." "Then, how is this possible?" "I don't know, dear. But I intend to find out. Walt knows everyone in the county. If someone's been using Tom's name to trick young women, we'll get to the bottom of it." After supper, Martha showed Sarah to a small but comfortable room on the 2nd floor. It had a narrow bed with a colorful quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a single window that looked out over the main street. Sarah changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of her situation. She was stranded in a frontier town, far from everything familiar. The man she had come to marry was dead, but someone had been writing letters in his name. She had no money to return to Boston, and even if she did, she had no job waiting for her. The textile factory had already filled her position. Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. A few lights still glowed in windows, and she could hear piano music drifting from the saloon. Somewhere out there was the abandoned ranch where she was supposed to start her new life. Instead, she was more lost than ever. She tried to sleep, but her mind kept racing. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas Mitchell's letters, written in a neat hand that promised her safety and companionship. Someone had gone to great trouble to deceive her, but why? What could anyone gain from bringing a penniless woman to Wyoming? As the hours passed, Sarah made a decision. She would not give up. She had come too far and sacrificed too much to simply run back to Boston with her tail between her legs. Tomorrow, she would start looking for answers. She would find out who had been writing those letters and why. And somehow, she would build a life for herself in this harsh but beautiful territory. The next morning, Sarah dressed carefully in her best day dress, a dark green wool that had seen better days but was still respectable. She pinned her brown hair back neatly and went downstairs for breakfast. Martha had prepared eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits, and several other boarders were already seated at the long wooden table. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet some folks," Martha said. "This is Dr. James Crawford, our town physician." A distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes stood to shake her hand. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Walker. Martha told me about your situation. Most peculiar business. And this is Miss Emily Watson. She teaches at our school." A young woman with blonde hair and intelligent blue eyes smiled warmly. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge, Sarah. I'm sorry about the circumstances that brought you here." The last person at the table was a gruff-looking man with weathered hands and a stern expression. "This is Frank Morrison," Martha continued. "He's our sheriff." Sheriff Morrison nodded curtly. "Miss Walker, I understand someone's been using a dead man's name to write letters. That's fraud, pure and simple. I'll be looking into it." After breakfast, Sheriff Morrison asked Sarah to accompany him to his office to give a formal statement. The jail was a small building next to the courthouse, with 2 cells in the back and a desk piled high with papers in the front. Morrison poured himself coffee from a pot that had been sitting on the stove too long and gestured for Sarah to sit in the chair across from his desk. "Tell me everything from the beginning," he said, pulling out a piece of paper and a pencil. Sarah recounted the whole story, starting with seeing the advertisement in Boston and ending with her arrival in Cedar Ridge. She showed him all of Thomas Mitchell's letters, and he examined them carefully. "This is definitely Tom's handwriting," he said finally. "I've seen it enough times on legal documents. But that's impossible, since Tom's been dead for 6 weeks. Could someone have forced him to write the letters before he died?" Morrison shook his head. "Tom died instantly when that horse kicked him. Doc Crawford was there within minutes. Besides, this last letter is postmarked 3 weeks ago. Then, someone else must have written it. Someone who could copy his handwriting. That's what I'm thinking. But who would do such a thing? And why?" Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's face. "Miss Walker, I have to ask, did you ever send Tom any money? Some of these mail-order bride schemes are just confidence tricks to get money from lonely women." Sarah shook her head. "No, nothing like that. He sent me money for the journey. $50. $50? Morrison sat up straighter. "That's a lot of money. Tom wasn't poor, but he wasn't rich either. Where would someone get $50 to send to a stranger?" "I don't know. But, Sheriff Morrison, what am I supposed to do now? I can't afford to go back to Boston, and I have no way to support myself here." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Well, you can't be the first woman to find herself in this situation. The territory's full of people starting over. Emily Watson might know if the school needs help, or Martha might need assistance at the boarding house. We'll figure something out." Sarah felt a small surge of hope. These people barely knew her, but they were already trying to help. In Boston, she had been invisible, just another factory worker in a sea of poor immigrants. Here, people seemed to notice each other, to care about each other's welfare. In the meantime, Morrison continued. I'm going to ride out to Tom's ranch and have a look around. Maybe there's something there that will give us a clue about who's been using his name." After leaving the sheriff's office, Sarah walked slowly through the town, trying to get her bearings. Cedar Ridge was much smaller than Boston, with perhaps 300 residents. The main street had a general store, a saloon, a hotel, a church, a blacksmith shop, and a few other businesses. Most of the houses were simple wooden structures, though a few of the more prosperous families had built larger homes with painted trim and small gardens. Sarah stopped in front of the schoolhouse, a whitewashed building with a bell tower. Through the windows, she could see Emily Watson teaching a group of children of various ages. The sight made her think of her own education, which had ended when she was 14 and forced to work in the factory. She had always loved reading and learning, but survival had come first. Pretty, isn't it? Sarah turned to see a woman about her own age approaching. She was tall and elegant, with auburn hair and expensive clothes that were clearly not made locally. "I'm sorry, the school. It's pretty. Very quaint." The woman's voice had a slight accent that Sarah couldn't place. "You must be the mail-order bride everyone's talking about. I'm Victoria Ashford." There was something in Victoria's tone that made Sarah uncomfortable. "Yes, I'm Sarah Walker." "How exciting. Traveling all this way to marry a stranger. Very brave of you. Or very desperate." Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I suppose you're quite disappointed to discover your intended husband is dead." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Yes, it was quite a shock. I'm sure it was. What will you do now? I suppose you'll have to find work. There's always the saloon, of course, though I doubt a refined Boston lady would consider such employment." The implication was clear and insulting. Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I'm sure I'll find appropriate work, Miss Ashford. If you'll excuse me." "Oh, it's Mrs. Ashford, actually. My husband owns the biggest ranch in the county. Perhaps you've heard of him? Charles Ashford." Sarah had not heard of him, but she nodded politely. "Well, Mrs. Ashford, it was interesting to meet you." As Sarah walked away, she could feel Victoria's eyes boring into her back. There had been something almost calculating in the woman's expression, as if she were evaluating a potential threat. But what threat could Sarah possibly pose? She was a penniless stranger with nowhere to go. Sarah spent the rest of the morning exploring the town and introducing herself to various shopkeepers and business owners. Everyone was polite, and several offered suggestions for employment, but nothing concrete materialized. The general store already had enough help. The hotel was run by the owner's family, and the restaurant was too small to need additional staff. As she walked back toward the boarding house for lunch, Sarah noticed a man working behind the church. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and strong shoulders. He appeared to be repairing a section of fence, and he worked with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to physical labor. Something about him caught her attention, though she couldn't say what. At lunch, Martha introduced Sarah to two more boarders, an elderly man named Professor Sterling who claimed to be writing a book about the West, and a young traveling salesman named Bobby Chun who sold everything from patent medicines to kitchen goods. "So, Sarah," Professor Sterling said over his bowl of vegetable soup, "what brings a cultured young woman like yourself to our little frontier settlement?" Sarah had grown tired of explaining her situation, but she gave him the abbreviated version. Professor Sterling listened with great interest, occasionally asking questions about her journey from Boston. "Fascinating," he said when she finished. "The mail-order bride phenomenon is one of the most interesting aspects of Western expansion. The shortage of women in frontier communities has created an entirely new form of courtship and marriage arrangement." "It's not a phenomenon," Sarah said a bit sharply. "It's real people's lives." Professor Sterling had the grace to look embarrassed. "Of course, my dear. I apologize. I sometimes forget that what I see as historical trends are actual human experiences." Bobby Chun, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward. "You know, Miss Walker, I travel all through this territory selling goods. I hear lots of stories, meet lots of people. Your situation, it reminds me of something I heard about 6 months ago." "What do you mean?" "I was in a town called Millerville, about 100 miles south of here. There was a young woman there, similar situation to yours. Came out from back east to marry a rancher, but when she arrived, the man claimed he'd never written to her. She had letters, just like you, but He swore he'd never sent them. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What happened to her? Last I heard, she was working as a seamstress in town. But here's the strange part. She wasn't the only one. I heard similar stories in 3 other towns over the past year. Always the same pattern. Woman travels out west to marry someone who claims he never wrote to her. That can't be a coincidence, Dr. Crawford said. Someone's running some kind of systematic fraud. But what's the point? Emily Watson asked. If they're not getting money from the women, what do they gain? It was a good question, and nobody had an answer. Sarah excused herself from the table and went up to her room to think. She pulled out Thomas Mitchell's letters again and studied them carefully. The handwriting was consistent throughout all of them, neat and careful. The paper was good quality, and the postmarks were from different towns, some from Cedar Ridge, some from a place called Riverside, and one from a town she'd never heard of called Copper Creek. She was still studying the letters when she heard a commotion outside. Looking out her window, she saw Sheriff Morrison riding back into town, leading a second horse. Even from a distance, she could see that something was wrong. The sheriff's face was grim, and he was riding faster than necessary. Sarah hurried downstairs and out onto the street. A small crowd was already gathering around the sheriff as he dismounted in front of his office. She pushed closer, trying to hear what he was saying. Found something at Tom's ranch. Morrison was telling Walt Brennan. Looks like someone's been living there since Tom died. Recent tracks, fresh ashes in the fireplace, food scraps. Someone's been using the place as a hideout. Any idea who? Walt asked. Morrison shook his head. Whoever it was cleared out in a hurry. But I found this. He held up a sheet of paper. Looks like they were practicing Tom's handwriting. Page after page of it. Like they were learning to copy his signature. Sarah's heart started racing. This was proof that someone had deliberately deceived her. Someone who had taken great care to make their forgery convincing. But who? And why had they bothered to bring her all the way to Wyoming if they weren't planning to steal money from her? Sheriff Morrison, she called out. May I see that paper? Morrison looked around and spotted her in the crowd. He nodded and handed her the sheet. Sarah examined it carefully. It was covered with attempts to reproduce Thomas Mitchell's handwriting. His name written over and over, phrases from his letters repeated dozens of times. Whoever had done this was methodical and patient. But there was something else. In the corner of the page, almost like a doodle, someone had written VA in small, delicate script. The initials were completely different from the practiced copying of Mitchell's handwriting. More feminine, more educated. VA Victoria Ashford. Sarah stared at the initials, her mind racing. Could the elegant, condescending woman she had met that morning be behind this elaborate deception? But why would the wife of a wealthy rancher go to such lengths to trick mail-order brides? What could she possibly gain? Sheriff, Sarah said quietly, I think I might know who's responsible for this.